Good evening. My name is Candace and I'm an event manager. On behalf of Town Hall Seattle, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation with Caty Borum Chattoo and Marcia Smith. As we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Caty and Marcia for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Check out our online calendar to see what is still to come this season at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the ever-changing landscape. We hope that you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. Our partner booksellers have also been hit by the negative effects of COVID and can use your support as well. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on the live stream page to purchase through Third Place Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for re-watching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. We will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. We will also take questions from the YouTube chat. We can't guarantee that we will be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arts and Culture series is supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Caty Borum Chattoo is Executive Director of the Center for Media and Social Impact and Assistant Professor at the American University School of Communication. She is an award-winning documentary producer, scholar, professor, and strategist working at the intersection of social change communication, documentary, and entertainment storytelling. She is also the co-author of A Comedian and an Activist Walk into a Bar, The Serious Role of Comedy in Social Justice, which also came out this year. Marcia Smith is president and co-founder of Firelight Media, which produces documentary films, provides artistic and financial support to emerging filmmakers of color, and builds impact campaigns to connect documentaries to audiences and social justice advocates. She has written several films alongside documentarian Stanley Nelson, including Freedom Riders, which came out in 2010, and won 3 Primetime Emmy Awards, and The Murder of Emmett Till, released in 2003, which garnered, among other awards, an Emmy nomination for Best Screenplay. Chattoo's book, The Story Movements, How Documentaries Empower People and Inspire Social Change, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Caty Borum Chattoo and Marcia Smith.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Candace. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, Caty. Thanks, Candace. And thanks to Seattle Town Hall and all of you who are able to tune in and join us today. Again, my name is Marcia Smith, and I am talking to you from the territory of the Wampanoag people. And Caty, should we just jump in?
Sure, let's just jump in. And I would like to also thank Seattle Town Hall for having us. And it's so important to support cultural and artistic institutions. And I know Marcia and I both share those values. And a special thanks to you, Marcia, one of my heroes in documentary film and well beyond, for doing this conversation. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Powhatan people in Anacostan in Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia. So I want to acknowledge that land, of course. So, Marcia, how should we start? Do you want me to tell you what the book is about?
I want you to tell me what the book is about. The name of the book is Story Movements: How Documentaries Empower People and Inspire Social Change. So I guess my first question to you is, I want to really get into why you wrote the book and what the reasons were, but first tell me about the title.
Oh, thanks for that.
Yeah, what even is a documentary these days?
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. Well, I wrote the book for a number of reasons, and I'll just start with, I guess, a little bit of a backstory, and this is in the preface of the book, because I felt like I wrote the book actually using a lot of principles that we use in documentary filmmaking. And what I mean by that is I started by naming my own gaze, right? So I wanted to start in the preface by saying, I want you to understand who I am in this work so that you understand the gaze that permeates this entire set of pages that you're going to read. And so I start by talking about how inspired I was by first watching documentaries, and that includes one of Stanley Nelson's early films about the Black press, a topic that I truly did not know anything about until I saw his film. It was profound.
That was the first film I worked on, actually.
Really? I saw it when I was in graduate school, and it was just this. It was, this makes me sound like such an old lady, but at the same time, we have to say to our younger viewers and participants that at that time, documentary wasn't as easy to find. And so discussions about the form and audience finding the form, it wasn't sort of as readily available to us. So sort of discovering this art form that was both cinematic and also journalistic, and depending on the lens from which you came, was also telling you about people and places that you felt had been missed by journalistic treatment and certainly by the entertainment marketplace. So naming my gaze, and then I'll just quickly get into the book. I'm a documentary producer, and so I started making documentaries around 2004, always as a credited producer, and I was really making documentaries with the intent to create social change. So that is also part of my gaze. I did not want to leave things the way that I found them if I was making a story about social injustice in some kind of way. And I also saw the way that documentaries could actually empower civil society and publics, which I write an awful lot about in the book, to not just learn about something, but actually in some cases be mobilized to take some kind of action. And I know we'll get into that, Marcia, because that's certainly what Firelight Media has done for a long time. And then also I'm a scholar of documentary, and I study and create through my center studies and research and convenings that really are designed to lift up this art form and to investigate things like the economics of documentary, diversity and equity, representation, who is telling whose stories, and why that matters so much in all storytelling. And it matters a great deal in documentary because we believe documentaries to be truthful and accurate. And I go to the trouble, I suppose, of talking about my role as a documentary producer because I wanted to write a book that picked up from this moment in 2004, 2005. It was the beginning of what we in sort of scholarly world call the participatory networked age of media, where regular people and civil society organization and makers of creative art had access to making media and raising their voices about injustice in ways that certainly follow from what we know from the analog age of social movements, but were different because of the technology and the platforms. And so I hadn't seen a book that was really doing that yet. And the other thing that was really important to me in this book, when we talk about contemporary social issue documentaries, I wanted a book that had the voices of the filmmakers in it. Because as a person who not regularly makes documentaries anymore, because I'm too busy doing all these other things, but until you've been in the space of making those decisions about subjects, about your ethical ethical codes, about creative choices, about how you spend time with subjects before you make the pact together to film something, I find it hard to deeply understand the practice of documentary if you've never been in that position yourself. And so my gaze is very much informed by my work as a producer. And so really, this book is about the contemporary rise, practices, motivations, and values of documentaries that interrogate issues and entire realities that we don't see represented elsewhere in the media system, both journalistic and entertainment. And it's also the stories and motivations of activists and regular people who come together after watching a film, like a Firelight Media film, and say, wait a minute, we've just learned something that perhaps we didn't know, or we see something that represents our community that we know to be true, that has not been properly represented. And we want to share information and engage. And that's the sort of civic part of this. And so the title, that was a long-winded way to answer your question, Marcia, but Story Movements is obviously a play on social movements. And this is really a book about the ways, large and small, that documentaries empower small and large movements that expand equity and justice. So hopefully the book lives up to that title, because it's like a big title.
Yeah, it's a big title. And I think, we're all in contemporary society kind of swimming in a sea of content of different types.
Yes.
Certainly during the pandemic, this is kind of all we're doing.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of questions for you about that. Well, let me ask you, where are you kind of rooting the beginning of the use of documentary in the way that you examine in the book? Is it connected to any particular period of time?
Thank you, Marcia, for that question, because actually the history of this work is so meaningful, and it was important. I am not a historian, so I'll go ahead and name that gaze as well. There are plenty of media historians who have written very, very detailed, time-ordered, obviously, chronologies of documentary history. And so there's a chapter in my book, chapter 2, that I call, I've already forgotten what I call it, but it's something like historical highlights. And it's meaningful because I wanted to explain that the rise of documentaries in the digital era that help empower social change and equity did not arise out of a cultural vacuum, that in fact, every moment that birthed documentary infrastructure in the first place, meaning audiences' ability to find them and documentarians' ability to make them, every aspect of that came from social movement pressure. And that's something that is a piece of history that is really worth celebrating in our documentary community. It's also really important to know it, because it really defines how we move forward in the future. And so just to explain that a tiny bit, and then I'll pick up on the time period, we can start from the beginning of media consolidation in this country, right? Which really starts at the very beginning of broadcast, when we had 3 networks, and that's what we had. It came from radio, goes into the broadcast network. And then we can look at the early movie studio system, where all power for entertainment media and entertainment film was held in the hands of 5 studios. So from the very beginning, 1930s, 40s, we have this consolidated media system. Now, why that matters to all of us is that means that our entire cultural representation of what is controlled by just a small handful of companies. Now, this is not news to any of us who study and work in media. But this is important to your question, Marcia, because in the 1960s, there are many moments that led to the birth of public media. And public media, we often don't give enough credit for the fact that public media fully opened the commercial marketplace for documentary. If we had not had public media, there would be no documentaries on HBO and Discovery and Nat Geo and on and on. So very briefly, the Kerner Commission report in 1968, which talked and warned about urban discord in America, and said, part of the problem, this sort of scathing indictment of media representation at the time, that said, it's basically, I'm grossly paraphrasing a really well-quoted report, but basically said, no wonder this is happening, partially because we have media systems that don't show us anything about how this country is really feeling, right? It's ignoring people of color. It's ignoring many, many communities around the country. So public media was birthed in part because of that cry, that movement cry for media reform. And, you know, a couple decades later, the style of documentary that came through public media. And then as we went into the verite movement of documentary in the 1960s, where people had smaller gear and they could sort of be telling stories from within movements, that led to a style that the commercial networks liked, i.e. HBO under Sheila Nevins. And so that opened up the whole marketplace. And so, you know, one thing, just to come back to your question, Marcia, that's important is that in those moments in the 60s, when the marketplace is starting to open up, not without great movement pressure, but in that moment, documentaries were always creating something that I call the dual distribution system. And this is so unique to documentary. It's not the same for entertainment, scripted entertainment media. It's not the same for journalism. The dual distribution mechanism really is a fancy way of saying documentaries have always lived inside grassroots movements and inside communities. So distributed through neighborhoods, all of the work that Firelight Media does, right, with organizations, and also on the commercial or journalistic marketplace. And so that is important to recognize from the 50s, 60s, moving on through the 70s and 80s to the contemporary moment, because that ethos of documentaries belonging to communities as much as they belong to how we view them as audiences, that is not something that comes just from the digital era. That's a deep value and ethos that came from social movements. Really in the 60s, cries for equity and justice and better representation, frankly. So these are sort of perennial pursuits, of course. We know for sure that this is not a solved problem. We're right in the middle of it again, but it's important to honor that legacy that really came along with us into the digital era, even as the tools changed.
It's really interesting because I think a lot of times people trace the history of documentary to a more anthropological,
yeah,
you know, the Robert Flaherty, the
that's true too.
Nanook of the North, you know, this this idea that is intrinsic to documentaries, but there is this other kind of history that is quite different. You know?
Well, it evolved, and I love that you brought that up because that is certainly right. I mean, you know, the first documentary that was called a documentary was in 1926, and you're right that we have these dudes like Grierson and Flaherty, which were making these films that were designed for kind of social responsibility. But one of the things that I write about in the book, and it's terribly important here to the implicit message of your question too, which is many of those films, while well-meaning, had such a colonial anthropological gaze. Like, look at these poor disadvantaged people, which is not conferring agency. And we would say troubling when it comes to social change, right? And social change comes from communities feeling empowered and represented and all of those things. So I think that the beautiful part of the doc history story, as it were, is that makers have defined it, maybe because we've never had to live only within one kind of infrastructure or like only one code of conduct. Documentary people have sort of always come together and said, well, this isn't right. We want to challenge this gaze. Oh, you know, and in the 1930s, there were alternative documentary filmmakers that were, I don't know how they got their hands on this equipment, by the way, because back in the day, it was like, you know, the huge cameras that only the studios and news networks had access to, but they were countering the official stories that were coming out from the government about what was happening with the Great Depression and terrible poverty. And they're like, it's making it sound like America is fine, and it's not. So we're going to make these.
It happened that there's only one branch that got the kind of imprimatur of being the roots of documentary. Because I think about the work of Zora Neale Hurston, or even the film we did on historically Black colleges had footage that was taken by Thurgood Marshall, actually.
Wow.
That show, it's like he was a lawyer. He had a camera a still camera, and he had a film camera that he took through the South to record conditions of Black schools and compare them to white schools.
Wow.
And this is, this is the kind of evidence that he collected in an effort to kind of show, in that case, a court, the disparities. But we don't think of that as, that's like activist documentary. It's not a film for public consumption.
Yeah.
But you could argue whether it's a documentary or not. So you kind of posit documentary as sitting between journalism and entertainment. Is that fair? How do you define a documentary now? And is that changing in your view? Are you concerned about how it's changing? Because I am, but I want to hear what you think.
Yeah, I am too. I know we're going to talk about that. Well, so, I, in the book, I do what one should do in a book, which is also honor the other people who have written about this form, right? So one of the original documentary definitions comes from the 1930s, actually, and it's enduring, I think, because it's very broad and flexible, which is great because documentary gets, as I write in the book, somewhat redefined and shaped by every new generation of makers, but the creative treatment of actuality from the Scottish guy, Grierson. And so what I write about in the book and my own sort of definition, and again, I should sort of name my own gaze here, is that my book and our shared work is not about what I would call sort of entertainment slice of life stories. My book is really about films that are designed, that are showing a social issue or lived reality of some kind and motivated at some level. There's a spectrum of this, at some level on the part of the filmmaker by what I call civic values, civic motivation, the idea that for the betterment of social progress, there is a kind of collective well-being and that it matters to us to, for example, correct inaccurate historical narratives, or it matters to us to expose environmental justice in a community that is never showing up very much or in a way with agency in journalistic portrayals and sort of daily deep reporting. So I want to make sure that I'm clear with our participants that social issue docs, and there's a whole range of those, is what we're talking about.
Not the penguins, in other words.
Yeah, even though love those too, but
Space documentaries are my favorite. But
yes. Well, nature documentaries, that's their own. Anything that gets us to support, stopping our ecological destruction, I would probably say is a social issue doc. But what I probably write about most often in the book about the definition idea is documentaries have the cinematic artistry of entertainment, of film, and they work with journalistic obligations. But here's where I think documentary gets its special spot, is that we know, and this comes out in interview after interview in the book, and this is my own lived experience as well, is that I think that we've been taught, certainly in this country, that norms of truth, what we mean by truth, must mean attempted objectivity. And in documentary, we often name our gaze. And in some cases, I don't know how you feel about this, Marcia, but in some cases, depending on the maker and the story, I think that's more truthful, because then we know the gaze from which that story and that lens comes. And so I think that when we say the practices of good journalism, we mean, did you check your facts? Did you check your sources? Are you accurate? Are you fair? Are you fair? It's not the idea of sort of one side and the other. What if the other side, thinking about when I made a film about a large chemical plant that basically was this settled law, this, found to be guilty of poisoning an entire community of lower income people with a chemical. Now, we were truthful in telling that story, but do I need the sort of PR story of the chemical company to make me feel like I've done journalistic practice? Not necessarily, right? So, but I think in terms of your concern, I think that there are lots of things that now we're in the streaming era, right? So now we're in the era where we have all of these other choices to watch documentaries. So on the one hand, this is really wonderful for audiences because people that have never seen a documentary before can find them on Netflix. They're on demand. That not Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, all of these streaming networks. But on the other hand, there are things that should really matter to us in documentary, particularly when we are talking about social issues and lived realities. And those things are disclosure of funding, I think disclosure of gaze, which is part of disclosure of funding, whether we end up with a full marketplace that is just sort of vanity documentaries about famous people. It's not something I necessarily want to see because documentaries are so special and how they motivate us. So that might be where we have a shared concern.
Yeah, I'm concerned because I think, the proliferation of content, of nonfiction content, has kind of muddied the waters, I think, in a way, when you and I started thinking about this, we were able to be more pure.
Yeah.
There were the good people who did social issue documentaries, and that was most documentaries, maybe some basic documentaries. But now there's a whole, subgenre in true crime, or there's tiger, and all these. It's almost as if there are these new, very commercialized takes and subjects that almost kind of latch on to the credibility that even the term has. The term documentary kind of confers, if not prestige, at least some semblance of stature.
Seriousness.
Right? And I don't know. It concerns me because I almost feel that when we get to contesting terms and we have to be so clear that we're talking about this part of documentaries, or these are documentaries, this other thing, that's not really a documentary. I don't know. That just concerns me.
Yeah, well, I'll just add to that a little bit. Yeah, I totally hear that. And actually, this is, again, why sort of historical evolution, it's not everything that we need to know, but we do need to understand these moments and trends because they come back, right? And so the advent of television and the rise of television is in some ways analogous to the rise of the digital age, right? It was a complete media revolution. The players that were dominant before, i.e. radio, had to completely change. And our consumer behavior was completely different. We were completely different culturally. And so the same thing is true of this moment. And we need to look at those moments in the same way. And I bring that up by way of saying, as I write in the book, in the very last chapter about the future of documentary, and it really gets into these issues that you and I are talking about, I write, and I am quoting another scholar who says, we've never in documentary been able to leave the entire enterprise up to the commercial marketplace, right? The commercial marketplace has a space for documentary for sure. We need the funding, we need the distribution. The fact that a film like 13th can be in 190 countries around the world is stunning.
Incredible.
But at the same time, if we look back at the lesson of the 1950s and the 1960s, documentaries were on network television in a massive way during that time period because they were in trouble with the FCC and the public because television at that point was seen as the vast wasteland, right? When Newton Minnow said that in 1961, they were like, you better change. So what happened was that the networks turned to documentaries and it became part of their licensing agreement. It's like, we are, and sorry, let me just complete the sentence. Because they were under pressure to show more programming that was clearly in the public interest. And so documentaries to the networks meant in the public interest, but they were required, right? And so they had, plenty of documentaries. Harvest of Shame was one of those movies, about poverty. And it turns out advertisers didn't like being criticized. And it was really a troubling proposition. And so those documentaries went away when the networks, were not regulated to do that anymore. And B, they found out that they can make a lot more money showing the public interest through breaking news. Now, that's a really important piece of history for us to understand. So flash forward, here we are in the streaming era. We have all this new money coming into documentary, whatever, but we've never been able to leave the success and the practice, the ethical practice of documentary. We've never been able to leave it entirely the commercial marketplace, because the commercial marketplace's job is not to think about democracy necessarily.
Right.
So these are important things for us to understand, and also to understand how that changed in the marketplace of documentaries. That documentary makers got together and said, what's going on in this new marketplace, i.e. TV? And, you know, I think we're at a similar moment in documentary where affirming what we mean, just like you said, Marcia, it's like what we mean by the kinds of documentaries we want to protect and lift up. And here it's really important for me to say, neither one of us is saying documentaries need to be didactic and preachy and public interest feeling for us to like them. So, you know, in the book, I write about films.
No one likes those. You can't. It's not important anymore.
No, exactly. I mean, films like Minding the Gap and Crime and Punishment, both were on Hulu, both were financed by public media and philanthropy. We need that robust system that is philanthropic dollars and public media dollars and distribution and commercial media. And I think that, as I read in the book, a kind of weakness in any of the three has always been a problem for documentaries. So it's like those of us who can work in organizations where we are able to have a wider view need to be, you know, having the conversations, having convenings like the one that the International Documentary Association just held, to really always be affirming that and work with the industry in ways that are bringing them along. And
we will have to debate that another day, Katy. I'm not sure.
Yes.
We have to try, but I'm.
Yeah.
I won't call myself a skeptic, but I think it's a tough mountain to climb.
I
Now,
do too.
when you wrote the book, Katy, you obviously talked to a lot of super fascinating people and picked apart some particular films that had particular impact. What are some of your favorite stories that you tell in the book?
Well, Marcia, I am going to turn that question around on you in a fairly predictable way. I feel like you might have seen this coming, because the story of the murder of Emmett Till opens chapter 3 of the book. And I want to say that writing a book, if you're a documentary maker in some way, writing a book is just like making a movie, which means that you start off thinking it's one book. And then if you let the subject speak to you and you listen, it must become a different book. And so it's not that I had set out like chapter 3 will start with the murder of Emmett Till, but I did this interview with you and I knew that was the story. I knew that was how I wanted to open the story. And so the murder of Emmett Till was a Peabody Award-winning film. I won't tell you about your own film, but I wonder if you could, just for the benefit of people listening, explain the story of that film and the impact that it had and what it meant for Firelight Media, which is really what the chapter gets into.
Sure. Well, we did a film called The Murder of Emmett Till, and it was released in 2003 at Sundance. But prior to Sundance, I should say, just to summarize the story for people who may not know it, Emmett Till was a 13-year-old Black kid from Chicago who went to stay with relatives in Mississippi in the summer of 1955. Short story long, he was murdered because he whistled at a white woman in a grocery store, and some of her relatives dragged him out of his relatives' homes in the middle of the night. Killed him. His body was found days later in a river. We know about this. Surely he's not the only person to whom this happened, but we know about the story of Emmett Till because his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, who was an incredible woman, decided that she was going to not only fight to recover his body and bring it back to Chicago, which she had to fight to do, but that she was going to have an open casket funeral, which she did, and displayed Emmett Till's mangled body. And there was a photographer at the funeral from Jet magazine, a Black magazine that existed at the time through the 70s, I think, maybe 80s. And the picture that the photographer took went around the world to, shocking effect, to see what had happened to this kid. So the story of Emmett Till is one that is very well known to Black Americans of a certain generation, less well known to younger people, but to anyone who was about Emmett Till's age at the time in 1955, maybe a little younger, certainly older, it was a bombshell, kind of seminal experience for many of those people. And before the film opened at Sundance, we showed it at the Schomburg Library in New York City in Harlem. And this was the first time we had shown the film publicly. It was a majority Black audience. We were nervous, always nervous showing film for the first time because you want people to like it, you want people to get it. And so we ran the film, the lights came up, people started talking, and to our surprise, people were really angry. You always want an emotional reaction. We did not actually expect it because we were so inside the film that we couldn't see it as an audience saw it. And what the audience was angry about was that we had identified people who had witnessed part of what happened to Emmett Till. Two people, one of whom actually saw him being taken away in a truck before he was killed. And these people were never called to testify.
It's incredible.
At the trial. They were never contacted by law enforcement because, of course, at the time, some might argue still, their testimony was not wanted because the objective of the trial was to let the guys go. So the audience was furious at that fact because people didn't know, right? I mean, all we get is the story that they arrested these guys, they put them on trial, they got off, but to actually see a Black witness that was never called was a shock to them, and seeing their reaction was a surprise to us. But what it told us was that there was more that this film could do in the world, even though it was 50 years later. And so what we decided to do after that screening, and we did it every subsequent public screening of the film, is we distributed postcards that were addressed to the Justice Department, urging them to reopen the case. So we distributed 10,000 postcards. We would collect them at the end of the screening. We would mail them if people didn't want to take them and mail them. And we mailed all those postcards. And then we got notes from teachers who had their entire classrooms write letters to the Justice Department. And in fact, the Justice Department did reopen the case. Said at the time that it was partly because of the film. They did not find anyone else to be held accountable for it, but they did reopen the case. So that, for us, it was eye-opening, I think, because, as I said, we learned that, certainly we wanted people to both learn from the film, but also to be entertained by the film. You want people to stick with the film. Now, it's not like you have a captive audience, so you have to be able to tell a story that's compelling. Yeah. But we also learned that there was more to do, that if this could activate audiences in such a way to be involved in what could be happening today, that we thought was, the highest use of the film.
Yeah.
I should say the film actually just last month, it's streaming for free on pbs.org, actually. It's called The Murder of Emmett Till. Yeah.
Excellent.
They just re-upped the rights last month, and so it's available for people to see.
Thank you for sharing that and letting me put you on the spot a little bit. It's such an important story that illustrates actually so much of what you and I just talked about, which is there was the dual distribution system that was happening with that film, right? So what activated the original spark of the sort of public mobilization was at a cultural center in Harlem. And that's worth saying. It was, and then it aired on PBS and won a Peabody Award, and just is a stunning, stunning film that is required viewing. But it was doing all of those. It was showing a piece, correcting an inaccurate narrative, missing information, and correcting. When you were telling the story, Marcia, I think about it's not just the narrative that we hear the first time these guys were arrested, blah, 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 but then it's the narrative that gets packaged and just passed down as just rote. This is what happened. This is what happened. This is what happened. And so 50 years later to say, there's really much more to the story. I mean, this is something, that's incredibly valuable about documentaries, sort of serving this, what I call an artistically interpretive function, which is not just that they're telling you what happened, but they're also digging in a deeper way, perhaps because of the amount of time to tell the story, or because of the amount of care to find the subjects, or the time has passed in a certain way. And so I also appreciate and write in the book about how that film and the experience of the audience led you to create now this long-standing work at Firelight Media in really training and inspiring filmmakers and others to use films as a tool for liberation. And so, Firelight is really known for. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, our doc people know this, but anyone who doesn't know, Firelight Media is one of the most important organizations that really leads on really inspiring and motivating and lifting up makers of color. And there's just nothing like Firelight Media. And so, you all have inspired, I think, a lot of other collectives and organizations that have come along. But I think that film story is just incredibly important. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And give us a couple other stories that to you kind of illustrate the main point that you're making in your book about the power of documentaries.
Yeah, so this is a little bit geeky for me to go through my table of contents, and I won't do that literally, but maybe a little tiny bit, which is every chapter starts with a verb. And it's meant to guide you in a way to say, oh, all of these add up to how documentaries function, how social issue documentaries function. And so, mobilizing for change is, I actually have my book right here. Because,
nice.
After you write it.
Let's see the cover again. Love the cover.
Thank you. And it was designed by a documentary filmmaker. I felt like that was important too. But it's, and I promise I'll answer your question, Marcia, but I'm looking at here, revealing new reality, evolving documentaries, and it gets into activating community, mobilizing for change, humanizing the headlines, shaping laws, interrogating hidden truths. So that was all really meaningful. I don't know if anyone has noticed that, but just that was actually really specific on my part. I wanted even the chapters to tell you something about what I meant about the functions of documentaries as civic storytelling. By civic storytelling, I mean they are social critique. They also provide a sense of civic imagination, right? What the world looks like when it's better. And I believe that we do that when we see lived realities that have been marginalized elsewhere in the media marketplace, both journalistic and through scripted entertainment. So that's a long way of saying, I think of social change, certainly in this book and in other aspects of my work, as this spectrum, right? Social change matters when we learn something new, when we're activated to do something, but it's not just about activating action. It's about seeing an entirely different lens, perhaps, or seeing your own community represented, which is a kind of solidarity building. And so that is, the power of representation is not for other people's gaze, it's for a gaze that is not well represented. And so all the films that I write about, films like 13th, which talks about the criminal justice system and its racialized system of oppression by Ava DuVernay. Films like Charm City, which tell a completely different story about what was happening in the Baltimore unrest in the wake of Freddie Gray's murder. I write about films that changed laws, from an environmental justice film called Semper Fi about toxic water contamination in a Marine Corps facility, to a film that changed laws for women who were convicted of murder for basically killing their abusive husbands. Literally, the films, it's not speculative, as you learn when you read this chapter. The films changed the laws. The policymakers watched the movies and said some variation of, I had never seen that before, or I had never seen that story told like that before, which means, that's about the chapter that I write called Humanizing the Headlines is also this idea. I think it applies to the whole book, actually. So I'll go ahead and just sort of single that out.
Yeah.
There is a kind of rote pattern, a kind of dominant cultural narrative that is painted about most realities that we know about. Most of us don't know the social issues or the lived realities of our country if it is not for the media portrayals of them, right? So when we talk about humanizing the headlines, daily beat reporting can only go so far, particularly when there are entire groups of people who are not enabled to be the storytellers, right? So humanizing the headlines means, what does it look like when we reject that dominant narrative and create counter narratives that are ignored, right? So I write about the film Heroine, from an amazing filmmaker named Elaine McMillan Sheldon. This is an Academy Award nominated film. This is a good example of what I mean. Elaine herself is from Appalachia. She's a filmmaker from Appalachia. And she said, I was just watching all this news coverage about the opioid crisis in the United States, and none of it was coming from my community telling my community's story. And none of it had hope or agency or efficacy, or even portrayed people suffering from opioid addiction. None of them even portrayed them as sort of human. So what does it look like when I tell that story? And it's a dramatically different story that has hope and agency and community. And so, it's hard to pick just one movie, as you can tell in my ridiculously long-winded answer, but they all do something different. But they all, I think, hit on that theme of telling a deeper, intimate story that moves beyond what we either think we know or what, as a member of a community, we know is not being told.
Well, what about the film Blackfish?
Yeah, the film Blackfish.
Yeah, Blackfish, and the effect that had.
Yeah.
And the kind of example that to be about what documentary might do.
Yeah, thank you. It's like you read the book, Marcia.
I love the
book. She's in the book. You're in the book. So there's a whole chapter about Blackfish, and it allows me to really talk about this kind of framework. And I'll try to do this briefly because I know we wanted to hear questions from our participants here. So Blackfish is a great example. Let me try to summarize this story really quickly. So Blackfish is an independent documentary film that came out in 2013. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, which is where many acclaimed documentaries start their life cycle. So it's a story about a captive orca named Tilikum. And as you get into the story, Tilikum is sort of portrayed as almost a human creature. And so you learn that Tilikum, who was held captive at SeaWorld, after being sort of captured at sea and separated from his orca family, that he eventually ends up contributing to the deaths of several trainers at SeaWorld. And so the film really gets into what might have happened for that to be the case. And we learn in the film that orcas have very human-like characteristics and are not meant to be held in captivity, and are certainly not meant to be held in a space that's as small as they are, depending on, considering the size. So the film comes out, and almost immediately there's a media narrative that is a sort of David and Goliath story. And so the media narrative picks up, and the aquatic park featured in the film goes after the film. This does not work out well for the aquatic park featured in the film. And basically, PETA and other animal rights organizations who already for years had been saying marine mammals in captivity is not something that we should abide by and allow to happen. And so the film created a narrative by which those activists could sort of reignite their activism, and PETA in particular, at the center of this, really led this sort of unrelenting public activism. So there are a number of things that happen that are important to think about. Oh, and of course, spoiler alert for anyone that does not know, 3 years later, the aquatic part featured in the film came out and said that we will end captive orca shows and,
Right.
So, not free the orcas because by then they're totally domesticated, but put them in sort of aquatic sanctuaries. So a couple of things are important here. The film was symbiotic with the media coverage around it. So the media narrative from journalistic sources really took on the narrative of the film. And every time there was a sort of attack from the corporation, reporters would write about it. The filmmakers would come out and say something about it. So it became this cycle that kept it in the public eye for 3 years. And also the film had this strategic layered distribution, which I talk about quite a bit in the film. It went from Sundance to theaters to CNN Films in the summer, which is sort of a broad mainstream audience. And then at the end of that year, it went to Netflix. So every time it would come out on a new distribution mechanism, there was a new opportunity for media narrative, a new opportunity for activism, and to sort of keep the story alive. And so that's really a story about contemporary digital activism that happened a lot on Twitter and social media. It's a story about the symbiotic relationship and role of daily beat reporting. It is certainly a story about civil society, i.e. activist groups that really can use documentary narratives. And it is the story about documentary storytelling itself, which gives an intimate view into a story that we think we knew because of how it's been reported, but perhaps we did not know the story that maybe was almost from the gaze of the orca himself, right? So it's a sort of very intimate kind of human examination. So there's a lot to learn in that example, but I say in the end of the chapter, we should not aspire to make films like this because we imagine that they have these sort of tidy social change stories that we can tell. That is not the point. This one just happened to have a pretty good ending, and it was worth studying the various forces that make that so.
I totally agree. The other part is just corporate stupidity.
It's such a good PR case study, really.
It really is.
It really is. It's like every time, and I interviewed the filmmaker in the book, and I said, well, how did that feel? I made a movie where the company went after the filmmakers. Very, very scary because you think, I'm just an independent filmmaker. What's going on? And she was telling me in the interview, she was like, oh my God, the company would come after us. And we were these independent filmmakers, and I would be in my kitchen in my pajamas like, oh, I guess I have to answer this call from whatever media outlet. And so the press was so sympathetic to that because they said, listen, we have science on our side, and they're putting out full page ads and talking points and sending it to press. And every time those film critics would get the talking points from the company, and they would turn around and write the story about how gross it was that they were getting this attack material.
Like, really?
Yeah, it's like what not to do 101.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So we don't have too much time left. I wonder if we have any questions. Is Candace there?
Sorry, just took a moment there. Yeah, thank you both so much. We do have one question. Let's see what it is. I haven't. I was waiting to come in, so I haven't read it yet. But it's from Richard. And he's asking, what opportunities are there for the public to support these type of documentaries, and how can one find out both what is being developed and what has come out?
Ooh, great question. Marcia, you want to start that one? I can think about it too, but I feel like you were just in the conversation.
I tell you, actually, if you have to go to one single source, I would look at PBS. Public television actually has, I think, a very high quality collection of documentary films. You know, we think about POV and Independent Lens, both of which are independent film showcases. They've both won multiple awards with multiple filmmakers. But also, you know, we've had several films that were part of American Experience. And there are other, anyway, I would definitely recommend PBS if you have to go to one single source. In terms of finding out what's been done and what's upcoming, you'd have to read the trade press, but I wouldn't even recommend that. I would say consult your local film festivals. There's probably at more than one. I love the smaller festivals because you get to see films that don't end up having huge distribution, but can be great films. And then, you know, when we can all gather together, it's great to be in an audience to watch these films in person. So I would definitely recommend local film festivals.
I love that. That's such a good response. I agree with everything Marcia said. Yeah, that's definitely right. And also, you know what, I'll just add to Richard. The International Documentary Association publishes a magazine that you can get both in print and also online. It's called Documentary. And I think of all the, you know, of all the various outlets that write about documentary, not just as entertainment, I feel like Documentary Magazine really covers trends, but not just trends. That sounds so tacky. It really features the voices of the people who are making the films and thinking about them. And so I think that if you want a handle on the kinds of questions and issues that are coming up, and certainly the films also, I think Documentary Magazine, I think it's documentary.org, is a really great resource also.
Yeah. Agreed.
Cool. Sort of the other part to that was how can the public kind of support ones that they do? Do you have any sort of suggestions about the best way for an individual to kind of get the word out about a new documentary?
I might actually go back to part of Marcia's first part of the answer, which is that you know, public media is here to serve the American people, and so, you know, it's partially funded by all of us. And so I think that's probably paying attention to public broadcasting, you know, again, because of, I hate to sound like such a history nerd because I'm not a historian, but once we really understand the role that public media has played in the entire marketplace for documentaries, I think it allows those of us who beyond those of us who work in media to understand how important that is. Like, even the slick, hot film that you might watch on Netflix or HBO, whatever, that marketplace came from public media. Because, you know, some of the original commercial marketplace distributors were watching what was happening on PBS at the time and said, well, I want to make, again, Sheila Nevins, I keep mentioning. So I think constantly paying attention to how public media can be supported helps keep the kinds of films that Marcia and I are talking about really alive and robust, because it's not that you'll just see those films on PBS. Films that are somehow touched by public media and public media funding are all over the marketplace, including the commercial marketplace. And so that's really important that we keep that system alive if we care about these kinds of films.
Great. This next one is from Susan, and maybe this will kind of close us out, wrap up the conversation about what you all are working on. She's asking, what are your next projects?
Marcia, you go first.
Well, we have a few film projects going on, some of which have been halted because of the COVID pandemic. The biggest one that's been halted is a 4-hour series on the economics of the transatlantic slave trade, which is about the business of the trade on all sides, meaning the Americas, Europe, Africa, and those economic relationships that existed. We can't shoot that film now as we had planned to begin shooting in April because we can't go anywhere. We have managed to start shooting a film about the Attica prison uprising in 1971 because that many of the people who are being interviewed are in New York. So we have been able to shoot part of that. A number of the guards actually have moved to Florida, so that's tougher to shoot.
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's in process, and we just recently finished a film on the crack era in the 1980s that will be on Netflix, I think sometime this year. I don't know exactly when, because they don't always tell you when. But yeah.
God, so
And
much.
then the other thing that I'm really excited about, actually, is that we've just had our first round of grant making. We have a new fund called the William Greaves Development Fund that is supporting new projects by mid-career filmmakers of color, who we have found often have a hard time making a third, fourth, fifth film and establishing a career. So this fund, we were able to raise some money for the fund to make grants for mid-career folks to start projects, and we've just finished our first round of funding. So excited about that too.
So great, so great. I guess I'll just say, because this is a book event, when I was writing this book, I realized, and again, this business of naming the gays, I just name it all right at the very top so that you understand. But I also say, I dip into some stories that are international, but this book is largely a U.S. centric view. And but I hinted at this while I was writing, and I said, but really, all of these trends that I'm writing about, speaking truth to power, speaking back to authoritarian regime, corporate power, all of it is happening all around the world. And so I said, really there needs to be a second book that's an international book. And I actually just got the contract for that book. So that one is called Radical Reality, Documentary Storytelling and the Global Fight for Social Justice. And it really is about the kinds of stories that are happening all over the world and the kind of collaboration that happens with activists and civil society and documentary filmmakers. So like Marcia's situation, I was ready to get out on the road to start, you have to go places to responsibly write a book like that. But I've had to pause the travel. So, that book will come out a little slower, but I'm really inspired by that. And I hope that folks find that as interesting. I mean, in places that, frankly, it is far more difficult to get out a film that is criticizing structures of power. And the fact that this is happening in places around the world is just incredible. So hopefully I can do that justice. So that's my project, in addition to, 1,000 other things.
Right. Great. Well, it has been so fascinating to listen to you both, and such an honor to have you. Ginny and I were going back and forth with questions that we haven't really answered most of them. So it's kind of amazing. Your talk was so great, so thorough. Such a fascinating conversation and topics. Thank you both for your work and for your hard work. It does sound like just really difficult work that you do, and I really respect you for it.
Well, Katy, congratulations on the book again.
Oh, thank you.
Congrats on the book. And
I appreciate that.
buy the book, everybody. It's really
Yeah,
good.
we've got the buy the book button here on Crowdcast. There's a link also on YouTube that's going to take you right over to Third Place Books. Support them and support Caty by purchasing there. I want to thank everybody in the audience for watching tonight. If you want to follow more Town Hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button in the top right corner. You can donate to Town Hall from here as well. But again, Caty and Marcia, thank you both so much for coming to speak with our audience tonight. It was really an honor, and I hope that we'll see you again.
Thank you so much for having us. Marcia, thank you.
Oh, congratulations, Caty.
Thank you.